I have to start with my experience with Max Kaiser. I remember watching a clip of Max talking about silver and that we were going to do a run on JP Morgan by accumulating silver. I really enjoyed his energy level and his sense of humor. And I'm a huge fan of Stacy Herbert as well. So I've been on their podcast before, and it was really exciting to see them take on this role in El Salvador of helping President Bukele with the Bitcoin office. My friend Giacomo Zucco reached out to me last year, and he invited me to come speak and provide a guest lecture for the Kubo Plus program about Bitcoin mining. When I landed, I had I felt something really special. It spoke to my heart that I was in Bitcoin country and finally visiting El Salvador. And then I provided the lecture. It was, 5 hours of, they were nice enough to just let me go on and on talking about Bitcoin mining. And so I went from A to Z, basically explaining the ins and outs of Bitcoin mining. I guess I did a good enough job that they invited me to come back for Bukele's inauguration. So I flew back for that, and that was a tremendous honor. I was part of kind of the Bitcoin influencers delegation. So that was a lot of fun. I'm a devout Catholic myself. Got to visit some Catholic sites in San Salvador. Saint Romero is a huge inspiration for me. Huge thank you to Stacy Herbert for inviting me to that as her guest. Third time I came was for the Adopting Bitcoin conference. And so that time I brought my whole family there. We got to stay on the beach in El Salvador, and that was a really fun experience. I can't wait to come back. I'll be back at the end of April for Kubo Plus again. I'm really excited about the direction of the country is going in. I'm always excited to see news coming out of there, and the whole Bitcoin community, from a grassroots perspective that has been driving Bitcoin adoption from the bottom up. And then, of course, with their Bitcoin reserve from that perspective as well. I think that they're going to lead in the 21st century. And I see it as just one of the most exciting places in the world.
Hello guys, welcome once again to BitCorner podcast. And today we're having a very exciting episode. This person has been in the Bitcoin space probably since the beginnings. I think is one of the persons that don't need any introduction. So we'll discuss a lot about things that you will find about the topics. But before that, and discuss all of the things that are coming in the new season of the podcast, I want to welcome Pierre Rochard.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Juan.
Welcome to the show. So, guys, for 2 years, I told you in the first episode, we have been doing, Bitcoin 101, and everyone can learn the basic about Bitcoin. I think we have accomplished that. So that's why this season we will go further into deeper stories. So this is how it's going to work. Every single episode, we're going to have like an episode thesis, which we're going to do like a storytelling. And that's why our new guests are going to be here. And we're going to explore further. For example, today, the episode thesis is that Bitcoin mining isn't just about energy or money. It's about strategy, sovereignty, and reshaping how the world builds trust. So, Pierre, before we dive in, I want to tell you that this episode might feel a little bit different from other podcasts, because at BitCorner, we don't just ask about trends. We follow stories that define where Bitcoin is going next, right? So, you have played a huge role actually in shaping how we think about Bitcoin, mining energy, philosophy, sovereignty, and you have very good pieces. Guys, I'm going to attach some of them in the podcast notes. But, so today we want to connect all those topics, and because those topics are wide in the podcast, we have covered a lot of things. It happens that also our audience is wide. So all the people that we are going to talk is range from Kubo Plus students, from known ages students to, node runners, experts like Bitmaker or Scott Nidalson, anyone. So some of them, of course, are new to this. Others are trying to figure it out, how to build with Bitcoin, right? Not just buy it. So my job is to guide them through your vision and hopefully give them clarity and optimism to to keep building. So we're going to divide the episode in three parts. The first one is how we got here. That in other podcasts is the origin story. This is just a cool way to say it, right? And the other one is what's happening right now, which is the topic that we're going to discuss. It depends. In every episode will be different. And what's your vision from the future? So that's how it's going to work. So let's start. You're one of the first voices connecting Bitcoin to deeper ideas, from co-founding the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute to your writing and now Riot. What clicked for you early on that stills that on you today?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to clarify, Riot a few weeks ago, but still happy to talk about Bitcoin mining. What got me really into Bitcoin was the intersection between open source software. So when I was in high school, I was installing Linux on computers and listening to Richard Stallman episodes about free software and the philosophy behind that users should be able to modify the code that they're using. And so that was really a fascinating rabbit hole for me to go down. And simultaneously, I was also getting very interested in economics, and in particular, a school of thought called the Austrian School of Economics that focused on, well, they don't necessarily focus on this, but this is what I was most attracted to in what they were writing about was monetary economics. So linking the macroeconomic cycle, the booms and busts, with what is going on with the money. And a conclusion I came to was that fix the money, fix the world. And so this was back in 2005 around. The only solution we had there was gold and silver. We didn't have Bitcoin yet, obviously. And so I was interested in sound money and precious metals. So when I heard about Bitcoin the first time, thought, and this was in the context of the Silk Road, it was around 2011. I thought that it was like World of Warcraft gold, digital currency, but ultimately not capped in its supply. I should have dug deeper. In any case, I found out about Bitcoin's 21 million cap at the end of 2012 when I was talking about Bitcoin with my friends Michael Goldstein and Daniel Kraywitz. I was in my last year of grad school. I was getting my bachelor and master in accounting at UT Austin. That's when they mentioned the 21 million Bitcoin. That's when it clicked for me that if this system can hold together and have the right incentives align, that it would take over the world of money, because ultimately what we want in a money is scarcity. So that it was open source and that it was scarce meant to me that it was absolutely going to gain adoption. And that's what got me obsessed with Bitcoin. So I've been thinking about Bitcoin since, researching it, writing about it, and being involved in whatever way I can be.
Another thing that I want to ask you, and probably, not everyone listening will know that what actually the Nakamoto Institute is in your shirt is. So, so can you explain its original purpose and what kind of legacy you think Satoshi actually wanted to leave for all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I learned about Austrian economics was through the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is an institution that's based in the United States that created a website, Mises.org, that had all of these articles and also PDFs of old books that went back to the beginning of the Austrian school and even before then, kind of proto-Austrian thought, and MP3s that I would download onto my iPod when I was going to high school. And when Michael Goldstein and I were I believe in Atlanta at a Bitcoin conference, the topic came up that there should be a Satoshi Nakamoto Institute that would do the same thing for Bitcoin, that would aggregate all of the thoughts around Bitcoin that came from Satoshi, but also came from cypherpunks before him, and then researchers after him that continue to develop kind of the ideological groundwork for Bitcoin. What is the context and the reason for Bitcoin's existence and for its value? So that's really what it's about, is education and preserving kind of this school of thought that has developed around Bitcoin.
That's super interesting. You know what? I also think that it's really important to learn those things, especially in recent events that we have seen, like what's going on around the world, right? Well, I think one of the examples we're gonna talk about that I also want to know what your vision is
Yep.
about what happened in my country, right? Not just what Bukele did, but how Bitcoin, besides all the noise that I right now with the IMF loan, but I'm talking about the grassroots, right? That how it's impacting a lot of people just to use this tool that it's not in the current system. There are powerful stories out there, and it's really interesting to know about that. I also want to ask you, and I'm doing like this kind of question to give a little of context to people. Who are you, right? So you also mentioned that worked with Riot, not anymore, but what has working directly in mining taught you that people might not realize in general in this topic? Because again, there's a lot of misinformation with Bitcoin, especially with mining. So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give some background on my experience in Bitcoin mining. So I'll start with when I was first learning about Bitcoin and I was on the Bitcoin Talk forums, I would see advertisements for a Bitcoin mining rig from what was called Butterfly Labs. And lots of Bitcoiners were sending Bitcoin to Butterfly Labs because it was a pre-sale, essentially. So they would put up a deposit to secure their delivery of mining hardware. And then it turned out that they were not able to deliver, and they ended up getting shut down by the regulators, by the FTC, because it seems like they were defrauding the public. And so I never had gotten involved in Butterfly Labs, but when I saw that happen, I did think to myself, well, this seems very risky because you're sending Bitcoin to a third party, and then you're hoping that they're able to deliver on their promise. And so from there, I kind of just focused on buying Bitcoin on Coinbase and not, getting involved in Bitcoin mining. That all changed when in 2021, the Chinese government banned Bitcoin mining in China. And China had a large percentage of the mining hash rate. They were, I believe, 80% perhaps at one point. Wow. And so when they banned Bitcoin mining, it caused a massive outflow of hash rate from China to the United States. Now, at the time, I was working at Kraken, an exchange, a global exchange. I was the product manager there for Bitcoin. We launched a Lightning integration that was highly successful. Overnight, we got millions of Kraken users onboarded onto the Lightning network. So it was really cool to see that. But
I was one of them.
Oh, that's really wonderful to hear. It is one of my, and now we had a great team at Kraken. I was just the product manager. We had designers, we had software engineers, compliance, legal. It was a real big team effort to get that integration in, because the Lightning network is very different than on-chain Bitcoin. So that was wonderful, but the legislators in the United States, Elizabeth Warren in the Senate and Frank Pallone in the House, saw the inflow of Bitcoin mining to the United States and saw it as a problem. So they started sending letters to the publicly traded Bitcoin miners suggesting that, asking lots of questions, but really suggesting that they stop. So, that they were concerned about the energy consumption, the carbon emissions, all of this. And so Riot approached me to join as their VP of research and to help push back on the public policy front to develop a strategy to defend the Bitcoin mining industry in the United States. So I went out and hired a head of public policy, Brian Morgenstern, in DC, who had previously worked for the Trump administration and who was very politically savvy and understood how to be involved in the policymaking process in a way that's constructive, and to start putting out, what our messaging is and how we're going to interact. So fast forward to Trump's election. Obviously, our efforts were highly successful in pushing back. And it was really on two fronts that I think that we really made an impact. One, the New York Times wanted to put out a hit piece that showed that we were emitting lots of CO2. So they even photoshopped a picture of our mining facility to make it look like it was bad air quality there, which was just false. And they tried to make it look like we were emitting CO2. And so I put out a funny video showing measurements of CO2 at our facility and showing that, in fact, we were not emitting CO2. And, it was a funny video, but it was also very substantive in the sense that in politics and in public relations, there's a saying, if you're explaining, you're losing. So you always want to have, you want to be on the offense and you want the other side to be on defense. And so the Bitcoin mining industry up until that point had very much been on the defense of trying to explain, oh, well, actually, a lot of our electricity comes from solar and wind power. And so, we do have clean energy in the mix. And that, is true, but it's also not impactful or as impactful as it could be from a policy perspective. And so we went on the offensive and said, look, Bitcoin mining does not emit any CO2. Just like a Tesla car does not emit any CO2. And that video actually ended up going viral and got more attention than the New York Times article did. And that's the economy that we live in. We live in an attention economy. And so whoever's messaging gets the most attention has the most influence in the policymaking process. So when Elizabeth Warren tweeted out the same New York Times article to try to attack us, we replied with the video again, and we were able to ratio her. And so it really has a tremendous impact on the politicians when they see that the public is not just divided on an issue, but divided 80-20, where 80% of the people disagree with her and only 20% of the people agree with her. Because at the end of the day, we live in a democracy, right? You can't have success in public policy if you only have 20% of the voters. You need to have at least 50% of the voters. And so getting ratioed on social media is actually a huge signal in politics that you're going down the wrong track. Now, the second point that we really succeeded on was that Elizabeth Warren was able to manipulate the Department of Energy into putting out a survey, a mandatory survey, asking all the Bitcoin miners, all the big ones in the United States, to provide information about their energy companies. So who are they buying electricity from? The purpose of this was to then publicize these relationships and to put activist pressure on the electricity companies to cancel the contracts and to cancel the Bitcoin miners. Because if we don't have electricity, then we can't mine. And so her purpose was to create a cancel culture backlash against the electricity companies for selling electricity to Bitcoin miners. So it's very important to keep those proprietary relationships confidential and to not dox our electricity providers. So we took her to, we took the Department of Energy to court. We sued the Department of Energy in federal court, and we went to the courthouse in Waco, Texas here. And the case really centered around the method by which they created the survey, declared an emergency. They declared a federal emergency that Bitcoin mining was causing a risk to the electricity grid. And really where this argument falls apart is that ERCOT, the grid operator here in Texas, had already stated that Bitcoin miners were being integrated into the grid in a responsible manner that did not violate any of the safety criteria that are already stated in the PUC or in legislative or in ERCOT rulemaking guidelines. And so the Bitcoin miners were already fully regulated and did not pose any kind of material risk to the grid. And so we were able to make that clear in our case in the litigation against the Department of Energy, and the judge immediately agreed with us. The judge handed down a restraining order against the government and said that the government had to destroy the data that they had collected and that they had to pay for our attorney's fees because this was such an egregious violation, an abuse of power, that Elizabeth Warren was weaponizing the government against a private industry for false reasons, that there was no emergency. It was completely made up. And so the third victory, obviously, was the election of Donald Trump. which
Mm-hmm.
was actually influenced by the Bitcoin mining industry in the sense that he rallied to our cause and we rallied to his. And he was very successful in building a broad coalition across industries that had been attacked by the Biden administration. So huge credit to him. I also think that when we look at the Trump organization and his family, they were debanked by the large financial institutions under political pressure. And so they realized the importance of having a decentralized alternative to the financial system like Bitcoin. And that made it clear to them that Bitcoin, not only is it an American industry that is employing thousands of people and creating tax revenue and jobs and all of this, but also that it's aligned with their values and it's aligned with their interests of having financial freedom so that people can be empowered to control their own money outside of the official system. So with Trump's victory, now not only is the mining industry no longer under attack politically, but we just saw yesterday news that Trump's son, Eric Trump, is joining a Bitcoin mining company here in the United States. So it has been a diametric, just a complete 180, a pivot on policy here in the United States. And, I'm always looking for a challenge. So that's when it became clear to me that, okay, the Bitcoin mining industry here is in good hands. It's time for me to move to the next challenge, which I see as being the integration or the Bitcoinization of the financial system and getting Bitcoin deeper and deeper into the financial system. We've started seeing that with MicroStrategy. I think that it's going to continue to be a trend and that we have to accelerate this integration.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, I was not going to ask you this, but you just a very important topic. That is, I saw the news about Eric Trump and Donald Trump. So they are joining with Hut 8 miners, right? So for context, they are formerly an American data centers, right? And now they are renaming and launching as American Bitcoin. So I don't know if you have any information about how it's going to work, this strategy or this new company with them that you can share with us.
Well, I don't have any insider knowledge, obviously, but I will say that at a high level, I think that it's an excellent initiative. I think that it's great for Bitcoin. I think that it's, let's look at the Bitcoin mining economics. I think that the economics of it are both a huge opportunity, but also very challenging. Bitcoin mining is the most competitive industry in the world. Hash rate is a commodity and it is globally produced because Bitcoin mining is permissionless. There's no barriers to entry. All you need is a mining rig, which, anybody can buy, and electricity, which anybody can produce. Throughout the world, there are lots of different sources of energy. Some of them are expensive. Some of them are cheap or free. Some of them are negative. So in some cases here in Texas, for example, we'll have so much wind and sun that the real-time price of electricity will be negative during particular times of the day. During other times of the day, for example, when the sun has set and the wind is low, the price of electricity here in Texas will be $5,000 a megawatt. So Bitcoin mining has to straddle, I see 3 different highly volatile markets that Bitcoin mining is at the intersection of. One is the hash rate market. So what is the difficulty level? 2 is the Bitcoin price. And 3 is the price of electricity. So, that I wish them well. I hope that their venture, unfolds in a very good moment in the market, and that if we have a real solid run for Bitcoin, that the hash price will appreciate and that they will do well. I'd also point to the fact that being a publicly traded Bitcoin miner gives you access to the capital markets and the strategies around that. And so we've seen the issuance of convertible bonds by Marathon, by Riot, by others, in order to develop a Bitcoin treasury strategy and to acquire Bitcoin on the market in addition to mining it. And so I think that it would really behoove them to explore those options and to continue to develop that relationship with capital markets so that they're really taking a multifaceted approach to Bitcoin mining, because focusing on purely hash rate growth, that has had great results in some circumstances. In other circumstances, it's led to overcapitalization of the Bitcoin mining hash rate and arguably, deteriorating economics in bear markets.
So let's say that mining is becoming like a geopolitical competition, right? Because we have seen the US, Russia, I think, all of them. I think China is going back, right, to mine.
Yeah, they are. Yes, that's what the data shows, is that they've kind of opened these spigots on bringing Bitcoin mining back in a smaller format than it was in the past.
And what could be the risk if, for example, that if United States doesn't follow this geopolitical competitions, like the risk of falling behind, or any nation actually, because now we're seeing that the US actually is going to support this.
Yeah, so I think that one is the economic risk of underutilized energy assets. And so any country that does not monetize its energy assets to the best extent that it can, leveraging Bitcoin mining, is going to fall behind in what I consider to be kind of the energy race. And the energy race is not just about Bitcoin mining, it's also about AI, data centers, it's also about industry, steel mills, aluminum plants. And so it's also about, and I think arguably the most important, households, right? We all want to improve our standard of living through the use of energy, for air conditioning, for dishwashers, right? All of these tools. And I think increasingly for cars, for example, for robots. And we're seeing the development of humanoid robots that combine the advances in electrification, right, digital, but also of AI, that going forward, we're going to need a lot of energy, and we're going to need it at the edge of people's households, but also at scale in these mega facilities. And we've seen it with Bitcoin miners at the 100 plus megawatt scale. And so I think that countries that have a real robust, all of the above approach to developing all of their energy resources, and not just picking, we're going to do this approach or that approach, they're going to come out ahead. And so I see Bitcoin mining as a particular, I don't want to say niche because it can be at scale, but it fits a particular load profile from an electrical engineering perspective that other loads do not fit. And so it really, I think, on any grid or any energy system, it is a necessary component to make the overall economics enhanced.
And I have a question that, there's a topic here in El Salvador, and it's that one of the proposals that Bukele wants to do is to also not just mine Bitcoin with the volcanoes energy, but also he wants to do nuclear. So it's actually safe, or is it just like another narrative from the media to do nuclear energy in any nation?
So I think that nuclear is safe and reliable. I think that what we have to look at is the economics of it. So if we look at nuclear, I think where it really does well is when it is providing base load, meaning that it produces the same amount of electricity around the clock, around the year. And so you have a that is kind of the floor for the energy system. But when we look at the seasonality of energy consumption, it's highly variable. So here in Texas, for example, we use a lot more electricity during the summer than we do during the spring or the fall. And then in the winter, there's often like 1 or 2 weeks where we use lots of electricity because we have a cold front and it's very cold and people turn on all their heaters. And so when we think about nuclear, you want to size it so that the nuclear is providing that steady base load that you need all year. And then the variable load on top of that can be natural gas, can be wind, solar, batteries. So all these technologies can be complementary. Now, in Texas, we also have access to very inexpensive natural gas because in West Texas, we have lots of oil and gas fields. but also throughout Texas for that matter. And so that means that we're able to use natural gas as base load as well. And so we're able to do that economically. And in fact, it's less expensive to use natural gas in efficient combined cycle gas turbines, which are basically jet engines bolted to the ground, than it is to use nuclear. In El Salvador, it's very different because El Salvador actually does not have oil and gas resources. So natural gas has to be imported via a liquid natural gas import terminal. And that the way that it gets converted into electricity is through a reciprocating engine. It's not through a gas turbine. And so that has its advantages, which is that it's easier to maintain, but the disadvantage is that it's less efficient. And so it's higher cost per megawatt than what we have here in Texas. And so here in Texas, maybe a very efficient natural gas turbine will be $20 a megawatt. In El Salvador, a natural gas reciprocating engine will be more like $80 to $120 per megawatt, which is actually very difficult to monetize with Bitcoin mining. But what resources El Salvador has, obviously you mentioned the geothermal. It also has really great solar opportunities in particular parts of the country. And I've heard that there could be some wind opportunities as well. It has name it hydropower as well, which is great. That provides some good base load, especially, when you have those big rains that, you want to make sure that you're kind of limiting the impact of that rain through the use of hydro. And I think that nuclear actually is a really great resource to use in that context, because it would just be too expensive to build natural gas pipelines from Mexico to El Salvador. And so building that capability in El Salvador makes a lot of sense.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I'm just thinking about all you have said, because it's really interesting, this approach. And that's one of the things that I like to ask, like experts like you, because that's what you don't see in the media, right? They don't like to explain those things that, no, it's like, nuclear is dangerous. It looks like Chernobyl, and then there people goes.
Yeah, and I'm sensitive to that as well. Like, obviously, I have a family, I have kids. I don't want to have radiation from a nuclear meltdown. But the technology is really advanced today, and that there are ways to make it very safe. And so I think that it is a technology that we have to use and harness safely, and that there's here in Texas, Abilene Christian University has a program for thorium reactors that use liquid salt technology that if something bad happens, it basically solves itself. The radioactive part falls into molten salt and it essentially freezes itself, and it doesn't pose any danger. And so there's passive technologies like that where if you have a meltdown, it's not like Chernobyl. It's just self-contained.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, as you mentioned, the technology is different. I think this was in 1986 around there. So, and today we're in 2025. So of course the technology and resources are quite different, right? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that Chernobyl, that's a condemnation of the communist system more than anything else. And so I think that if we have an approach that is very transparent and accountable so that people are held responsible, even if it's a small thing that goes wrong, that they are held responsible and either lose money or go to jail, right? Depending on the situation, then you can actually have people who are motivated to make sure that everything is safe. And so I trust that, Bukele will have an approach to this that highlights the accountability and transparency.
Hopefully, yeah. Another thing that I wanted to ask you is that, critics often says that Bitcoin mining, we have been talking about this, that waste energy. That's one of the things that I want to debunk here. So every time that someone that is expert on Bitcoin mining and on energy, I ask the same questions, because actually, Bitcoin improves energy systems, right? So if you can share with us a real world example that shows how this works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that when I was working with Riot and we would go talk with policymakers, and it really comes down to two parts to it. Of one, what is the purpose of Bitcoin mining? The purpose of it is twofold. So first of all, it's about issuing the new Bitcoin onto the ledger in a way that is decentralized. Before Bitcoin mining, every ledger was populated by a centralized mechanism. So it's a bank that is adding dollars to a ledger, or it's a mint that is adding gold, right? Minting gold is a way of adding gold to the ledger. And that when you have a centralized system like that, it gets co-opted and it gets controlled by political authorities and it gets manipulated. And so, with mints, they started diluting the gold and debasing it and adding base metals to it. With banks, they have bailouts and they print money, and they creates a massive inequality in society, and that inequality then becomes a political problem as well. And so Bitcoin mining is a way of issuing the asset in a way that is fair and decentralized, where anybody who has access to electricity and to Bitcoin mining rigs anywhere in the world can add Bitcoin to the ledger. And that competitive process prevents what monetary economists call seigniorage. Seigniorage is the monopoly profit from issuance of a currency. So every time the Federal Reserve creates a dollar, it costs them nothing. And so they have a 100% profit margin on issuing dollars. With Bitcoin mining being very competitive, sometimes it's break even, right? Where nobody makes any money off Bitcoin mining. And so that is actually of a benefit to society to not have seigniorage. And instead, the seigniorage ends up being monetized into energy assets, right? And so it is paying for energy infrastructure, whether it's power plants or transmission and distribution lines. The other part of it, obviously, with Bitcoin mining is that there's the transaction fees. So in addition to the new issuance of Bitcoin that gets paid to the miners, they also get paid transaction fees. And this allows Bitcoin to be a decentralized clock. So the Bitcoin miners, by issuing a block or proposing a block every 10 minutes, what they're doing is they're creating a timekeeping mechanism and ordering transactions onto the ledger in a sequential manner so that you're not spending the same Bitcoin twice. So this is the double spending problem that Bitcoin mining solves, that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote about in his white paper. And that's a breakthrough in computer science. Before this, all of the clocks for ledgers were centralized, and that created sources of manipulation as well. Now, it's all about being decentralized on the Bitcoin side. On the energy side, the ability to monetize energy assets is actually critical, because if you look at energy infrastructure, it's built for peak times. So as I mentioned, demand for energy is very seasonal, and your peak times might be like 1% of the year is when your energy system is being fully utilized. The rest of the year, your energy system is being underutilized. And that means that everybody has to pay for these fixed costs that are not being used, when it's 70 degrees outside and nobody needs their air conditioning. And so you have overbuilt infrastructure, which you need for the peak times because nobody wants to have a blackout or a brownout. Bitcoin mining allows you to monetize those assets outside of the peak times and to be able to contribute resources, contribute revenue to energy companies so that ends up lowering the bills for everybody else. Because now the fixed costs are being spread over a wider base of electricity consumption.
Absolutely, yeah. That's one of the things that I was thinking about, because Scott Nidalson came also to the podcast a few months ago, and he also gave me one of these amazing examples that I didn't even think about this, but he says the guys in Africa that I don't remember the company. So they say there are, for example, villages that in poor regions in Africa they even don't have electricity. So why the government or the states or whatever, the governor, don't put electricity there, right? Because the people that live there can barely afford to live day by day, right? So they cannot pay the electricity. But he says but if you put an electricity grids and infrastructure and everything, but they don't pay it, and then you put Bitcoin mining or a company of Bitcoin miners will come here and they will pay you to use the energy. And of course it will be excess of electricity, and the electricity can be delivered to them. So you're putting a company there, you're having profits, and you're helping people. So there are so many cases in how you can actually take advantage of Bitcoin mining, right? So it's super interesting.
Cuando dejas tus activos digitales en un exchange o en custodia de alguien más, te expones a riesgos de terceros no deseados. A diferencia del sistema bancario tradicional, Bitcoin te permite tomar el control total de tus fondos utilizando tus propias claves privadas. Esto te permite ser soberano y esencialmente tu propio banco. Al tomar el control de tus Bitcoins, puedes evitar riesgos innecesarios de terceros. Almacenar tus Bitcoin en custodia de terceros como los exchanges puede exponerte a ataques de actores malintencionados, gobiernos o estafadores que lo único que quieren es apoderarse de tu dinero. Las billeteras de hardware aumentan la seguridad de tu billetera porque tus claves privadas se almacenan en un dispositivo especializado que no está siempre conectado al Internet. Como te he dicho antes, mantener tus claves almacenadas en un dispositivo en línea puede exponerte a factores adicionales de ataque, por lo que se recomienda usar una billetera de hardware al almacenar grandes cantidades de Bitcoin durante largos periodos de tiempo. Jade es una billetera de hardware no custodial para Bitcoins y Liquid que ofrece opciones de firma simple y firmas múltiples. Yo personalmente lo utilizo para almacenar mis Bitcoins, ya que me siento mucho más seguro manteniendo mis Bitcoins en una billetera fría que en una almacenada, por ejemplo, en mi teléfono. Si estás pensando en adquirir uno para ti, no olvides utilizar el código de descuento de nuestro show, BitCorner Podcast. De esta forma estarás apoyando directamente el show y además obtendrás un 10% de descuento para la compra de tu billetera fría.
Another thing that I wanted to ask you, I have two more questions about mining, and then I want to ask you about Salvador. But one of the recent books that I read was Software by Jason Lowery, and yeah, he argues that the Bitcoin is like a power projection in cyberspace. Right? So whereas proof of works as like a military deterrence without the violence, right? So I don't know if you have any thoughts about it. Like, do you agree with this framing, or if it is actually Bitcoin can be used as a power projection to protect also the information and the data of the people, right?
Well, I think that there's the hash rate mining side of things, and then there's the BTC monetary asset side of things. And I do think that both of them are directly related to national security in their own ways. So on the Bitcoin mining side, I broadly agree with Jason's thesis, and I do think that it is not as well understood as it ought to be in, both the Bitcoin community and outside of it. So to me, like when I think about what historians will write about in 100 years, they'll point to China banning Bitcoin mining as one of the biggest mistakes in geopolitics. Just a phenomenal blunder, because it's, first of all, you've got to make sure that your transactions are not being censored on the network. And so if you're abdicating your role and you're banning yourself from Bitcoin mining, you're basically outsourcing transaction selection to the rest of the world. And you are hoping that they're just going to, based on your transaction fees, that they're going to include your transactions. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. At the end of the day, if they don't want to, you're going to have to pay higher transaction fees in order for them to do so. And so you're really kind of negotiating against yourself when you ban Bitcoin mining, because you're saying, okay, we're going to not have this commodity hash rate be produced in the United States or in China, and we're going to ask others to produce it for us, and then we're going to pay a premium for it by paying higher transaction fees. So on top of the fact that you're undermining your energy security domestically because as we've been discussing, now you're crippling your infrastructure by starving it of a source of revenue, which just doesn't make any sense. So I think that it's just really important from a national security perspective to want to have as much Bitcoin mining domestically as is economically feasible. And that it's also a form of a canary in the coal mine. That is that if you're not able to secure your hash rate from being hijacked by hackers, then it shows that your cybersecurity is not working. And that also applies to Bitcoin BTC as well. So, for example, we saw with the Bybit hack, North Korea hacked an exchange and stole their Ethereum. And so, to me, there's the economic dimension of that, which is, okay, now that exchange has lost its Ethereum. But there's also the national security aspect of it that North Korea is a bad actor. You know, they are developing a nuclear weapons program. They're a totalitarian regime. They're anti-freedom. They stand for the opposite values of our country. And that it is awful that they now have more resources at their disposal due to this security breach. And so I think that there's really a very important conversation to be had that the United States, every country, and from the North Korean perspective, this applies to them as well, right? That they want to secure their digital assets and their mining against the United States because, you know, they believe in Marxism or whatever it is, or worshiping Kim Jong-un. And so I think that policymakers have to understand that if they take the position that Bitcoin is bad, and so we want to ban Bitcoin here, that is a self-defeating attitude. And it is, frankly, it's completely nonsensical because all they're doing is banning themselves from Bitcoin. And they're encouraging the rest of the world to adopt Bitcoin and pushing it offshore. And so we have to find a way to simultaneously acknowledge, and this is something that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the largest financial institutions in the world, he went on national television and he made the point that Bitcoin exists above governments. That's why it doesn't make sense to ban Bitcoin, right? Because it's above you. So all you're doing is just banning yourself. So we have to balance the fact that Bitcoin is decentralized, acknowledge that, accept that, and find our place within that system, right? And that the proper role for government within the Bitcoin system, because we now live in a Bitcoin world, right? Bitcoin is more powerful than the United Nations. It's more powerful than NATO, right? So how do we integrate our national security strategy into the Bitcoin system in a way that secures our interests? And our interests are around three pillars. One is private keys. So how do we develop a sovereign grade custodial solution? And I think that Senator Lummis's bill, the Bitcoin Act, does this very effectively. Two is how do we secure our hash rate? And I think that because the United States has the world's most advanced capital markets, that we're able to essentially, make sure that, and the most advanced energy system. And also that, this is why I think Bitcoin mining has really succeeded in Texas. We have a free market in electricity here in Texas. And that free market is not an accident. It is on purpose. It is designed to be a free market by the policymakers, by the legislators and the regulators. They want competition in order to drive down the cost of electricity. And that attracted Bitcoin miners. So, the hash rate being in the United States, that's not an accident either. That's a result of our free market, both from a capital perspective and from an energy perspective. And so continuing to advance that is in the U.S. national security interest. And third is nodes. So I think this is the area where the United States has most underinvested, is making sure that we have unparalleled node infrastructure from a cloud perspective, right? So we need to identify strategic data centers where we want to make sure that not only is the U.S. government operating Bitcoin nodes, but also private companies are operating nodes and doing so in a way that is secure, is pseudonymous, and is decentralized. So that way, we're able to leverage, the United States has, I'd argue, the most advanced cloud infrastructure with AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure, but Equinix data centers. So all of this, we want to make sure that we have a coherent strategy that simultaneously embraces Bitcoin decentralization, but also acknowledges that we have very clear interests in developing this technology and harnessing it.
Absolutely. I have a question. If you have to do like a national Bitcoin mining strategy, what will be like non-negotiable?
Yeah, I think non-negotiable is making sure that we're creating the correct environment for Bitcoin mining, and not that the government is involved in Bitcoin mining directly, but rather that it is attracting the necessary capital assets and entrepreneurs who are going to do the Bitcoin mining. And so it's all about creating the right framework and set of incentives for it to thrive. And I think that's a non-negotiable. I think if we get into putting taxpayer money into Bitcoin mining, I don't think that will achieve the outcome that we want from a policy perspective of maximizing hash rate, and it will, essentially waste taxpayer money.
Absolutely, I think so. I have before I'm going to ask you some things about Salvador because you have been there, and of course I had to ask you. This is a Salvadoran Bitcoin podcast. People will kill me if I don't ask you about that. But in the podcast, I have a little game that the audience probably already know. But my previous guest have a prepared question for my next guest. So my last guest was Gary Leland, and he made a question for you, and you will have to do a question also for my next guest. So I'm gonna share with you his question. Harris, let me know if you can see this.
My question is, like, when you first got started, or at any point in time, have you been a shitcoiner? Yeah, did you? I admitted that I was buying shitcoins to begin with, but I was trading them for Bitcoin. So, have you ever been a shitcoiner? Could be an easy answer. I mean, it could be a no. But if so, tell us about it.
That's a great question. So, Gary's going to get me canceled by the Bitcoin maxis. I can think of two cases where I was S-coining. One was somebody wanted to donate Litecoin to me, and I spun up a Litecoin node and took in their donation and then sold it on Coinbase for more Bitcoin. The second was that when I was working at Kraken, I was asked to help with the due diligence on a potential acquisition of a company that had a Lightning product and an Ethereum product. And I, as a product manager, think the most important thing you can do as a product manager is to use the product, right? Put yourself in the shoes of the user. So I'll admit, I acquired a small amount of Ethereum, probably like $50 worth of Ethereum, to test the product out. And the product did not work. So, provided that feedback to the corporate development team that, from a product perspective, this is not a good acquisition. Now, I then put the Ethereum on. So I wanted to try other Ethereum products as well. So a Coinbase wallet is a non-custodial wallet created by Coinbase. So I transferred the Ethereum there and didn't think much of it. Then after we launched Lightning, our CEO, not Jeremy Powell, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, Jesse Powell. Sorry, Jesse.
Okay.
He asked, if I would accept a NFT to congratulate me on the launch of the Lightning product. And I had mixed feelings about it, but at the end of the day, I felt like that it was a tremendous compliment and an honor to have the CEO, want to recognize this achievement with an NFT. And, that's his way of doing so. And I respect his culture. So I accepted the NFT into my wallet, and I still have it, and I still cherish it. So I'm a hodler of an NFT, and that's it on my S-coining journey. So I thanked Gary for helping me get canceled on that.
The good thing about the show is that you also have the opportunity to make a question for my next guest. But I'm gonna tell you when we finish recording because I never say it live.
Okay.
But that was a cool answer. But we talk in the show and we both have been shitcoiners, so don't feel bad. We have been on that road. Thankfully, we are here. That's the important part, that we're here.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I want to also ask you about El Salvador. Before starting recording the podcast, you told me that you have been there 3 times, so you probably have seen some changes, right? So if you can share a little bit about your, let's say, highlights of your 3 roads there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to start with my experience with Max Kaiser. So before
Who's that guy?
Bitcoin, when I was interested in silver, I remember watching a clip of Max talking about silver and that we were going to do a run on JP Morgan by accumulating silver. And I really enjoyed his energy level and his sense of humor. And so, I'm a long time OG Max Kaiser appreciator, and I'm a huge fan of Stacy Herbert as well. So I've been on their podcast before, and it was really exciting to see them take on this role in El Salvador of helping President Bukele with the Bitcoin office. My friend Giacomo Zucco reached out to me last year and said that he invited me to come speak and provide a guest lecture for the Kubo Plus program about Bitcoin mining, and that was really exciting to me because one, I love Giacomo as a friend and as an OG Bitcoiner. I've learned a lot from Giacomo over the years, so of course I said yes. I'll come help with Kubo Plus, and so I flew down there. When I landed, I had I felt something really special. It spoke to my heart that I was in Bitcoin country and finally visiting El Salvador. I don't know, there's something special about that country that when I landed, I felt it. And then I provided the lecture. It was, 5 hours of, they were nice enough to just let me go on and on talking about Bitcoin mining. And so I went from A to Z, basically explaining the ins and outs of Bitcoin mining. Still only covered things at a high level because, 5 hours, you could go talk about Bitcoin mining for 1,000 hours. I guess I did a good enough job that they invited me to come back for Bukele's inauguration. And so this was his second inauguration. So I flew back for that, and that was a tremendous honor. I was part of kind of the Bitcoin influencers delegation with Dylan Leclerc, who's a longtime friend of mine. Jack Mahler's also a huge fan of his. And there was Peter St. Onge and Zuby. So that was a lot of fun. We went to the inauguration. I got to see Malay there, obviously saw President Bukele and his beautiful family. And his speech was in Spanish, but I know enough Spanish that I can kind of understand some parts of it, and really enjoyed it, and the blessings as well. I'm a devout Catholic myself, and so got to visit some Catholic sites in San Salvador. That was very meaningful to me too. Saint Romero is a huge inspiration for me. So that was wonderful. We went to the inaugural party afterwards and got to meet, President Bukele's brother, other members of his family, members of the government, ministers. I mean, things that, I would only dream about, right? Like, it's just, a situation where it's like, wow, I can't believe I'm in the same room with all these people. And I get to talk about Bitcoin with them and Bitcoin mining. So that was really a magical experience. So a huge thank you to Stacy Herbert for inviting me to that as her guest. And then we went out to the Bitcoin guys. We went to Denny's. I think it was like at 1 a.m. after the party, and had our Denny's breakfast, there, which is just a really funny memory to look back on. We were all wearing our tuxedos, it could have been a movie. Mike Germano was there as well, and he's now heading up PubKey. So really, really cool role for him. Third time I came was for the Adopting Bitcoin conference. And so that time I brought my whole family there. We got to stay on the beach in El Salvador, and that was a really fun experience, visiting lots of family sites, went to a water park, and got to speak at the conference. So overall, I'd say that I love El Salvador. I can't wait to come back. I'll be back at the end of April for Kubo Plus again. I'm really excited about the direction of the country is going in. I think that, every El Salvadorian that I've met has been just exceptionally friendly and warm. I I love the coffee. I've been ordering Bean of Fire, yes. And I'm not just saying that because I like El Salvador and I like Bukele. It tastes better, okay? It's really good coffee. It's great coffee, and it's better than any coffee I've ever had. So
Volcano soils. Volcano soils.
Yeah, it's just it has a very, I don't know, it's a very balanced flavor that I can't wait to go visit where the beans come from and meet some of the people there. So hopefully that'll be an opportunity at some point. But yeah, just a huge fan of El Salvador, and I'm always excited to see news coming out of there and the whole Bitcoin community, from a grassroots perspective that has been driving Bitcoin adoption from the bottom up. And then, of course, with their Bitcoin reserve from that perspective as well, I think that they're going to lead in the 21st century. And I see it as just one of the most exciting places in the world.
Absolutely. Talking about the coffee, yeah, the coffee in the mountains, it's really good. Actually, my family is from Santa Ana, and actually, this doesn't have at all to deal with Bitcoin, but somehow my mother, if anyone listening, any Salvadorian knows this reason, she says that now it's very difficult to buy coffee. And not just talking about Bukele's one. In general, like there's a huge demand on coffee. I don't know why, but yeah, this is one of the things that we Salvadorians are worried about. But yeah. You mentioned that you talked with the Cuba Plus students in El Salvador, I think last year, and magnificent projects also with all of them that are their nation, Primer Bitcoin. I probably mentioned all of them every single episode. So, but what was that experience like? And what do you share, especially with them? And I am assuming that you're coming back in April to go back to the Cuba Plus again, right?
Correct, yes. So I really enjoyed it because, I talked for an hour and they were still eagerly paying attention. And then I talked for another hour and nobody was yawning, nobody was falling asleep. And so that's how I ended up talking for 5 hours, is because they had great questions and they were very attentive and eager to learn. And I think that, that is just a huge blessing as a teacher, to have students who are there for the right reasons and are just paying attention and taking notes and absorbing as much information as they can. So it was a really awesome experience. It was great to meet them and to spend time with them and to hear about how they've learned about Bitcoin and what they're working on as well, because a lot of them have Bitcoin related projects that are really exciting.
Absolutely. I also saw I think an article that you told students in El Salvador, to save in Bitcoin and not just rely on the government to do it. So why is that mindset, to anyone that is listening, that mindset shift so important? Yeah,
absolutely. It's all about shifting to the long term. So Bitcoin is very volatile in the short term, and it's not a good mechanism for short-term savings, right? For short-term savings, you should use dollars, because otherwise, if the Bitcoin price goes down in the short term, then you won't have enough money to meet your goals. But if you're thinking about it long-term, longer than 5 years, then you need to be saving in Bitcoin. And you need to be doing it, self-custodially on your own keys, because that's ultimately what Bitcoin's value is derived from, is that you're controlling your own money. And so while the government is doing a great job of accumulating Bitcoin for the people, I also think that for individuals, when a government is accumulating a strategic reserve, it's to meet future strategic goals. So for example, it might be to finance the building of a nuclear reactor in 10 years, right? But when an individual is saving in Bitcoin, it's to meet their personal goals. It might be to help their children get through school in 10 years, right? Or to do something, start their own business in 10 years, or to buy a new house in 15 years, or to pass on money to your grandchildren in 20 years. And these are long-term savings goals that, are personal. And so you need to have a personal savings account in Bitcoin so that you're accumulating for the long term.
Absolutely. Another thing that I want to ask you, and I try not to talk about this in the podcast because it's kind of noise right now, but I just want to know your thoughts about it. It's about the IMF loan. I probably have heard that now in El Salvador is a very hot topic. So my take, and I always said when I talk about this in the podcast, is that what matters is the grassroots. So Bitcoin, we have to remind that is for the people. So you don't need the permission of anyone, even the government or any institution, to use Bitcoin. That's one of the, as you also said, right, previously, Bitcoin is more powerful than NATO or any other institution or government. So it's for the people. And that's why it's really important, the education about Bitcoin. But what we know is that the IMF loan has effectively restricted the public sector from mining or volunteering acquiring Bitcoin. That I think it will stop in a couple of months. I don't know. But just asking your opinions, what do you think that means for the future of Bitcoin in El Salvador?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that I trust President Bukele's judgment. I think that, he's very intentional with his actions, and that he's looking at what is in the long-term interests of the El Salvadorian people. And so I don't second guess, his approach to the country's finances. He has built up a substantial strategic reserve as it is. I do think that the El Salvadorian private sector needs to step up, and, every company, every individual needs to be contributing their part, and that it's really great to have a balanced approach to that. So second is that it's really important for us to think about, hey, how do we orange pill the IMF? How do we help, on a global perspective, how do we help Bitcoin adoption? And I think that eventually the IMF will change their approach, and I think that it'll be to the benefit of everyone. That's something that I take as like, okay, anytime that you have an anti-Bitcoin critic, it's like, let's understand their perspective, let's meet them where they're at, and let's try to get the IMF to change their stance on it, because it's not sustainable, right? You can't have a global monetary system without Bitcoin, and the IMF has to find its role within that if it wants to have a role at all. Right. If it wants to continue to be relevant into the 21st century, it has to try to understand Bitcoin more deeply than it has. Right. If it just views it as a volatile speculative asset, then it's not going to make it. And that's, I think, my takeaway from this situation.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. In the end, it's like, it doesn't make sense to make these kind of deals. But in the end, you're seeing that no matter what the governments do, there's also El Salvador will continue doing these grassroots efforts, right? Actually, that's why we're going there.
El Salvador has made tremendous progress. Nevertheless, if we look at the debt situation, I believe it has $20 billion of debt, right? And so these are mistakes made in the past, right? And so we can't time travel to the past to balance the budget. But it's really a question of going forward. How can the government improve its standing in the capital markets so that its cost of financing goes down? Because if it's able to lower the interest rate that it pays, then that means that there's more resources available to help meet the needs of the El Salvadorian people. And so those needs are tremendous, right? The people of El Salvador, they need clean water. They need cheap electricity. There's all sorts of infrastructure that, continuing to improve the roads, improve, telecommunications, all of this, that needs to be financed. And I think that it makes sense that to accelerate long-term GDP growth, there needs to be investments made today. And so I think Bukele is making a wise decision here, even if, from a Bitcoin perspective, it's different than what people's expectations were.
Absolutely. Pierre, we're going to start wrap it up. Probably I'm just going to ask you two more questions. One is actually that something is happening those days that I don't know if you have seen, probably have seen, that in the mempool, we have seen that some blocks are being mined empty, and it has lowered, I think the transaction now can be sent for 1 sat in empty blocks. I don't know if you have any thoughts or perplexed why is happening that, because it's super odd.
Well, I think the demand for block space is very cyclical. So we have times where there's a lot of demand for block space and transaction fees go parabolic. And then other times there's more supply than there is demand of block space. And I think that will continue forever. And so I think that transaction fees will continue to be volatile. Right now, I think that there's a lot of financial activity that used to clear through the Bitcoin network now clears through third parties, right? So people are trading Bitcoin on Coinbase or on CME futures or Bitcoin ETFs, MicroStrategy. As other layers of the economy adopt Bitcoin, it takes activity off of the primary layer. And I actually think that's good, right? Because ultimately those transactions were not benefiting from Bitcoin censorship resistant properties. And so if a transaction's not benefiting from it, why have it be on the blockchain, right? Take it off the blockchain, make room for transactions where the parties need to use the Bitcoin blockchain, right? And I think that the Bitcoin blockchain should be a mechanism of last resort, right? It's like the monetary backbone of the global system. And so there's no need to have every single coffee payment be on the blockchain. Only transactions that would otherwise get censored should be on the blockchain, or, if that's the most economical, best route to take. So that's my take on that. Yeah.
Okay. And all right, so two more questions. One is that you have co-authored one of the most important papers on Bitcoin transactions fees and settlement finality. So what is the biggest thing people misunderstand about the long-term mining incentive model?
Yeah, I think that typically people assume that the new issuance of Bitcoin, as that gets cut in half, it needs to be replaced by transaction fees. And that's just not the case. Transaction fees only exist in response to congestion on the network or censorship. So if there's censorship, people bid up transaction fees. If there's a lot of demand, people bid up transaction fees. If transaction fees are low, that's perfectly fine because the hash rate can actually decrease. And so you can have a downwards difficulty adjustment on the Bitcoin network, and that does not impact transaction finality, because transaction finality is not the result of hash rate. Transaction finality is the result of permissionless mining, right? As long as anybody can mine Bitcoin, then we know that we can achieve transaction finality. And so it's really about equality of opportunity rather than any kind of outcome from a hash rate metrics perspective.
All right. And my last question is that, let's say El Salvador student or Cuba Plus student, now that you're going there, is here in this episode. What do you hope they take from all this episode that we have been talking about?
I hope that they take that there's a lot of economic opportunities, both within Bitcoin and outside of Bitcoin. But when it comes to long-term savings, the best way to achieve their goals is by holding Bitcoin as savings for the long term. And so, even if they get a career in AI software development and they get paid lots of money, that they need to set aside some percentage of that in Bitcoin. And so that way they have an opportunity to have the rewards of Bitcoin, even if they're not necessarily working in Bitcoin.
All right. Pierre Rochard, thank you so much for your time. I have a lot of more questions, but I don't want to be an episode of 5 hours. I know that you're going to make probably 5 hours again in El Salvador.
Yeah.
So you need to protect your voice.
All right. Thanks, Juan.